Welcome to Let's Talk Space Medicine. I'm Kyle Anderson, your medical student slash space nerd host. For your listening entertainment, I gather my other medically inclined space nerd friends to talk all things space medicine. With our powers combined, we hope to explore and entertain the medical questions that stand between us and the stars. Today's orbit, genetic enhancement. Is that the question? As a brief disclaimer, anything discussed on Let's Talk Space Medicine should not be considered medical advice, and is therefore not a substitute for seeking medical help from a doctor. We are simply interested in entertaining topics within the field of space medicine. So, welcome to Orbit 10, where we hope to talk space medicine within the time that it takes for the International Space Station, or the ISS, takes to orbit the Earth, 90 minutes. And today we're joined by three of our space nerd friends, two space nerd friends which we have been on the show before, and a new friend. His name is Sean, and thank you so much for joining us today. Just a brief introduction to Sean. He is our special guest coming in from Georgia, where he is interested in genetics, studied genetics in undergrad at the University of Georgia, is now a medical student at Mercer University, and has interests in aerospace medicine, plans on joining the Navy, or is currently in the Navy throughout medical school, and has a whole slew of research efforts: synthetic biology, nutrient genomics, chromatin modification, cancer biology, and anti-aging. What a special guest indeed, and what a great topic to have you on for today. So thanks for joining, and tell us about yourself and maybe how we connected and how you got involved.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, super excited to nerd out on space medicine stuff. So we connected through a meme on Twitter, as uh, as is only appropriate. Yeah, I just saw that you were posting great stuff on Twitter about space medicine and your thoughts on publications coming out. And you asked really great questions, and I couldn't help but introduce myself and see if we could get to know each other. And you've carved out a really cool part of the internet that just talks about this really interesting field. So that's why I'm here today. And then as far as like how I got to where I am, it's basically been a series of really fortunate events happening. Started off doing research when I was really young and as a senior in high school, just through an internship program that landed me in a cancer biology lab, actually here at my medical school, which I ended up going to 5 years later. So that was a really great opportunity. Had to study a lot and catch the PI's attention, going from just a regular lab assistant into an actual researcher, moving a project forward there, and was able to take that experience and work for a company while I was in UGA studying for genetics. I was able to do or to lead a project in nutrigenomics, studying about how we could take nucleotide polymorphism information from companies like 23andMe or Ancestry and deliver some sort of recommendations based off of that for clinicians to use with their patients. That was a really, really cool project. And then from there, also got into a lab at UGA. UGA has a really good genetics program and pretty rigorous though, and they make their bachelor students produce a thesis at the end. And so I got to work on my thesis in chromatin remodeling at the Lewis lab. Unfortunately, 2020 happened, and I was one um, chip experiment away that I was not able to do because the lab shut down. So I did not get to really finish up my thesis as much as I wanted to, but such is life. But I got into Mercer University. I've been going there, and last summer I got to work on a really cool project, or really pick up a project that I had started a long time ago, and move it forward. And that was focused more on the anti-aging space. So yeah, it's been bouncing around from project to project and just getting in. Like I mentioned before, memes are a great way to introduce yourselves to people because I got my thesis opportunity, or I got into the lab that I got into because I made a meme post on Instagram, sort of like joking about how I was cold emailing professors trying to get into labs and no one was, no one was giving me a chance. And then making that meme of my grievances, uh, one of the supervisors for this lab was following me at the time. She was like, "Hey, why don't you come by and do an interview and see if we vibe?" And we did, and she took me under her wing. Her name was Abigail Courtney, or is Abigail Courtney.
Yeah.
She's great. Shout out to her. So yeah, that's how I got here now. I'm still I go to a rural medicine university, so they of course teach medicine, but they really focus on rural medicine, which is actually pretty important for space medicine because it in space medicine the doctors who have to handle health crises in space, you're sort of almost as if you're rural, meaning you're void of a lot of resources that you might otherwise have in a high tech medical facility or something. You have to figure out how to fix any type of problem and any type of solution. So I think for me in approaching this space medical field, because I kind of try and think, what can we accomplish with as little resources as possible? Um, but yeah, so that's kind of how we got here.
So I have a follow up question from that last little bit. You said accomplish as much as you can with as little as possible. A lot of times people wouldn't think that genetics would be that answer, but the more that I think about it, genetics kind of is, because essentially you do a lot with a little. You're able to either help someone from getting in that wrong position in the first place, or you're able to help them with some kind of therapeutic or medication that's specific to them. So I guess your thoughts on genetics in that kind of rural environment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of my big theses in medicine is that, like, especially with rural medicine, is that we're finally going to be able to level the playing field in a sort of way. Um, it's kind of insane how, if you are a rural citizen, you can basically just discount 10 years of your life, 10 to 5 years of your life, depending on your gender, compared to an urban citizen, just based on the fact that you're so far away from medical attention. And so, most of the technology or technological innovations that we do get from the medical field in general, they're amazing, they're great, they're miraculous sometimes, but they're really only applied if you have the facility to apply them. And so, if you don't, it doesn't matter, right? And so, a lot of the problems that happen in rural medicine is can be boiled down to, well, what's your access to those resources to begin with. I mean, if your closest doctor is 2 hours away and the closest hospital is 4 hours away, and that doctor in that hospital is already serving like thousands of patients as well. I mean, we saw that, I think it was Albany, Georgia, was hit so hard by the pandemic itself that it was one of the like highest death rates in the world for a brief moment in time. So it can get things can get out of hand, and if you need serious medical attention, it gets out of hand pretty quickly. So how do we prevent that, right? Like the number one goal would be, let's prevent even getting there, because genetic technology doesn't offer too much when it comes to the actual treatments, right? When you actually have heart failure, we have good protocols for that. Like when you actually have a stroke, we have treatments for that. You don't need genes to know that this person, has a blood clot, right? But what can I do using genetic technologies? I can give you a score of like, how likely are you to develop a blood clot? And if you're more likely, well, why don't we adjust your lifestyle in order to prevent that as much as possible? Or maybe, if that means, if you have a higher likelihood of a number of different disorders, maybe you should consider moving. just because it's not unlikely something happens and you're going to need that attention, and hopefully that saves lives, right? So I tell the nice part about genetics is the cost is coming down so quickly. We could distribute this technology and this benefit pretty equilaterally across any sort of clinical setting. I mean, the cost to sequence things is low and is lowering pretty exponentially. And then the application of that information is also improving. Like doctors are getting more educated in how to apply that. We're getting better protocols and how to approach that subject. We're educating people. We're figuring out how to educate people
Mm-hmm.
about this technology. And a lot of money is being poured into this space right now by the NIH. So, yeah, I'm pretty hopeful for it being a tool to, like I said, equalize.
Yeah, I think to follow up on that, I was chatting with my uncle who was just interested in all things kind of science and technology, and we were just chatting. I was like, "What is moving at an exponential rate, or what's going according to Moore's law in your field?"
Mm.
Because he was around for the computers the sizes of whole university buildings, and now so he's experienced that, and so he was like, something's going to happen to you that's similar. What aspect of healthcare is that? And I'm like, the first thing I said was like personalized medicine, genetics. So I think everyone here is you know interested in genetics at some level, and I think a lot of people, I think physicians in the future are just gonna have to practice it. So, um, any thoughts from Ryan or Vlad on just kind of that in general?
Absolutely true. Sean, it's nice to have you on the show, and it's nice to meet you as well. I think, at least while listening to you, I was thinking of some of the work that I'm doing myself that I probably mentioned previously on the show. I'm basically doing something similar to what you mentioned with looking at SNPs, and and I think you were talking about this from a perspective of nutrigenomics, if I heard you correctly. I'm kind of doing something similar with immune function, taking a few studies, one of which is the twin study, to try to turn that into some kind of paper. So I was hearing a lot of cool stuff coming from you, and it's exciting to know at least another person who's like kind of in that. I know Vlad is like twice the genetics. I'll let him add on to that. He's twice as interested as I am, I think.
All right, there's no about like twice or three times as more. We're all in lower genetics here. No, but yeah, it just when you talk about that, it kind of really geeks me out thinking about all the different approaches that we can take with genetics, thinking about what your susceptibilities are to certain diseases, how can we treat them, what you can do to prevent. Just thinking about it's almost Sisyphean the amount of work that we have to do figuring out which genes are related to which diseases, and then trying to get through this problem of like linkage disequilibrium when you have multiple genes related to each other being inherited together. Which of those genes is the one that's actually causing the blood clot versus the other one that's just making your hair slightly more tan than the next person? So, I mean, looking at the GWAS studies, looking at all these different approaches that we take to look at the genes and then figure out, okay, which ones are likely related to these groups of people that we looked at who have these diseases. And even then, there's all sorts of biases that could be thrown in there. Like when you think of a healthy group of people, how do you really define a healthy group of people?
No
Right. And
such
so
thing
really,
as normal, right? No such thing.
yeah, I mean, and then not to mention like you have different groups of people from different areas, different histories, different groups of people coming from different locations coming in and intermingling with one another. Like it's just I want to be there so badly with this like personalized medicine, but it's still so much work ahead of us. So it's
Oh
awesome to
yeah,
have you on the show, and
absolutely.
I love the perspective that you've given.
Yeah, I think we were, once we connected on Twitter, we were just, I knew that you would come, you bring a great perspective, but, we really wanted to have some kind of like either debate or kind of elucidate some topic or have something to not just inform, but to kind of go one step beyond. That's kind of the goal of the show. And so we kind of came down to this idea, back to the space medicine side of things, the idea of genetic enhancement. And I was talking to someone recently about this topic, and I think the best way that I described it is, when Sean and I were talking, it was more of it's less of a question of how much we'll be genetically enhancing, or it's whether not that we're gonna do it or not. It's how much. And what I mean by that is we enhance our lives. This is kind of an ethical argument. Like we enhance our lives medically all the time. So you have, prescription glasses, help you see. It's an enhancement. It's, some people consider it being a part of that person's identity. You have things that are more internal, like orthopedic hardware. When people have total hips and total knees that help them walk again, that's like enhancing them with some kind of technology. And in this day and age where we're refining the tools of genetics to become sharper and more powerful, it's really like we're going to do genetic enhancement, but really, what is the appropriate level at this point in the field of space medicine? And we wanted to talk about, in particular, the idea that to combat radiation. And so one of the big red risks in the field of space medicine is the idea that cosmic radiation will cause genetic damage. So it's kind of a one-to-one. If we can do something about the genes, then the astronaut will perform better when they're exposed to radiation. And so yeah, it was just I thought it was are we going to be screening astronauts before they go up? Is this going to be on the astronaut application? And this is just for everyone. Are we going to, are we going to be genetically selecting in a Gattaca-esque way? Are we going to do that? Or are we going to try and mimic, what is the genetics would be doing with a medication? Or are we going to use genetics on the back end to kind of augment an astronaut's response? And so those are the three categories that I kind of see going forward. I don't really feel comfortable with the first one.
I can help.
Yeah, so those are just kind of the three categories. You guys comments on those three categories or what you think? Feel free to jump in.
I have something to start with, unless you'd like to, Sean.
No, go for it.
So I actually have had some lengthy discussions with my PI about the Gattaca question and about how to like kind of phrase research, at least what we are working on, in such a way where it kind of anticipates this as a potential issue. And I guess, at least speaking for myself, I would hope that any work that I put out that kind of used someone's genes, or what, if they have like variants at certain loci that are really important for immune function, that put them at higher risk than other people, I would hope that would be something that wouldn't prohibit a candidate from becoming an astronaut, but would help identify something that they need to be ready to do something about in space. So really, I see it as I like to see it as more of like a preparation type of thing. Like, what do we need to bring? What do we have to be keeping in mind before we send this person in space, given what we know about their genome? But on the other hand, to kind of waffle a little bit or stand on the fence here, I think it's possible that you could find some genetics. There are easily abnormalities that people could have in their genome that would preclude them from doing like a year in space in some situations, I would think.
Yeah.
And
I know
yeah,
one that comes
go ahead.
to mind. Well, one that comes to mind would be like a Lee-Fraumeni syndrome, where you already have a mutation in P53, right? Like that would be a pretty, patients who have something like that, and for people who are listening, P53 is a really important gene for cancer and avoiding cancer, and you only have two copies of that, or two alleles of that, and so if you are missing one already, you're down to one, and the majority of these patients develop cancer throughout their lifetime, living normal lives, right? So putting them in an environment with exponentially more radiation, not probably a good idea. So I think certainly there will be cases like that, which of course, I would hate to make space and space exploration, or even just space tourism, be an exclusive sort of field. Um, but there are other tourisms and sort of activities in life that prohibit people already for good reason. And so it's always, and I know you guys have talked about this in the past before about like at the end of the day, we want to protect people at all cost from this extreme environment if that's what's required. But I think for the most case, there's a lot of there's already been a lot of people who've been to space who maybe they shouldn't have on paper, but they've survived, cancer treatments and went to space. There are people with prosthetics who have gone to space, hip replacements have gone to space, like some pretty big major things that you would maybe think, oh, that person probably shouldn't go to space, and yet here they are on long trips. So I think we could be surprised in how resilient some people are. But just like you're saying, wouldn't it be nice to know, like, what we should expect or what we could produce for these people that might make nothing go wrong, and that'd be the best case scenario, right? And if the very worst, if something does go wrong, we would know what is most likely to go wrong ahead of time, so we would have something for them in an incident in space, because that's the worst case scenario is you get an incident in space. Like, what are you supposed to do? There's not a lot of options right now. So yeah, I think getting framing it in that way is the best way to do it.
Yeah, I certainly agree. Part of the uncomfortableness to me comes from the idea of like a ethical ragged edge. So you have some kind of you know risk for a particular outcome. At what percentage risk into what degree in the future merits a decision of yes or no. And so you have a really hard time, is 51%, risk or 49% risk. People, humans in particular, are not good at evaluating future odds and predictions in a objective way. And so that's where a lot of my kind of hesitancy to use it at all. It's like if you're not going to use it right, don't use it at all. And that's kind of that's not right, because we are going to. It would be negligent not to use such a tool, to screen someone, to help change a mission profile, someone with that P53 mutation. Maybe they could go to space, but just not to Mars or to a deep space thing. Maybe they could go up for a couple days. When you brought up the hip replacements, it definitely reminded me of the Inspiration 4 mission with the medical officer on it having a hip replacement, or actually multiple orthopedic reconstructions due to a cancer diagnosis. Very inspirational. And so it's like, yeah, maybe she can go to space, but not for too long. So those are just kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, just to add to the conversation as well, I think at the moment we're kind of struggling to figure out which genes are related to which diseases are related to which like disease outcomes, right? Like mentioned before, we don't know what groups of people are truly healthy enough to use as controls for some of these diseases, for some of these genes that we can identify. And for some of these genes that we do identify, it's not that you inherit one gene by itself, you inherit a whole group of genes together, which is kind of the annoying thing about genetics, is that things are, if genes are close to each other, you kind of get all of them at once. You don't get a pick. And so that makes it really hard for geneticists and scientists to figure out which genes are doing what. So if we are struggling at the moment to figure out, which genes relate to which cancers, we have some good idea for some of them, like the BRCA genes. Everyone's always familiar with them. I think it was Angelina Jolie had testing done, and she had a BRCA gene that came back, giving her a higher risk of breast cancer. But then there's other things that you can think of as well, like the Leaf-Romini gene, pretty clear. It's a very clear disease outcome. But some of those things where it's like you have a slightly increased outcome and you have some of these changes in your genetic code, can we really say it's the change in the genetic code, or is it because you're living next to a highway? So it's kind of hard to figure that out. And so it's by even making it even harder to kind of make this screen of genes and relate it to an astronaut and say, oh, hey, if you go into space, you're going to have this. So we're probably going to not give it to you. We're not going to let you go on this trip.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
like that here.
Yeah. That's kind of why I thought the way that we chose some articles before we got on the air today, and I thought this was a good way to kind of narrow in using the lens of space medicine to help us kind of figure this out. So I think all of us would agree, and definitely chime up if you don't agree. But radiation presents it, if not a large risk, if not the largest risk to astronaut health on long duration space missions. So that's just kind of that's a fact that I'll lay right here. The second thing is that medically, from a flight surgeon standpoint, from someone who's caring about an astronaut pre-flight, during flight, and after flight, all three components, we should do something about that. Anything. We should do something about that risk, right? And so you can obviously stop, from an engineering perspective, you can engineer your spacecraft to stop radiation from coming in. But the job of a medical officer is to essentially make that astronaut as healthy as you can within the environment that they're exposed to. And one of those tools happens to be kind of highlighted by this first article. It talks about the key points for the development of antioxidant cocktails to prevent cellular stress and damage caused by reactive oxygen species during crewed space missions. And so what this article really wanted to talk about was antioxidants, are commonly they're in the the popular fiction. That you eat blueberries, you're going to be healthier. You need drink smart water, or drink things with antioxidants. They're healthier, right? But what is actually diving into that? What does that actually mean? So these things called reactive oxygen species essentially can cause cellular damage, mainly in the mitochondria, one of the components of the cell, and can cause those cells to be really unhappy and eventually lead to kind of the tissue being like aging, becoming more brittle and aging. But essentially, we should do something. If we're going to do something about radiation, we should do something using these antioxidants. And so this article really wanted to talk about, how do we go about this? What are some of the problems? And actually, in our early conversation with Sean, he actually has some experience with antioxidants. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a majority of my work with anti-aging has been spent focusing on P53. And so P53 is a huge component of kind of colloquially known as the defender of the genome, because if anything goes wrong with your cells while they're trying to replicate, it stops that process. It freezes and hits pause and says, hey, we've got an error here. We need to fix this before we move on. And if everything goes well and nothing's wrong, it's fixed and your cells move on in the whole cell cycle and they replicate. That happens trillions of times all the time. Like, it's constantly going on. And if something wrong happens to that protein, you can get some pretty severe effects happening over time. And so what happens is you start accumulating more and more mutations. What's fascinating is that other animals have P53 as well, and some animals have more P53 than others. Particularly, I'm talking about elephants is what I focused mostly on in my recent research, and it's a well-known, or it's a known paradox known as Peto's paradox, which basically is an observation that, okay, you have mice, which are tiny mammals, and they have cells. And then you have humans, and we're maybe mid-sized mammals, and we have cells. And then you have elephants, which are large mammals, and they have cells. Now, the cells that make up mice, humans, and elephants, they're all roughly the same size. So the size itself is dependent on just having more cells. Well, more cells and more replication typically should lead to more cancer, but that's not what we see. In fact, we see less cancer and longer relative lifespans. So why is that the case? Well, one, just by looking at the genome of an elephant, it's clear they have many more copies of P53. In fact, they have 20, right? So we have our one P53 gene, and we have 2 copies of that gene in our genomes. They have 10, and they have 2 copies of each, so they have 20. So if anything happens to one, it seems to be fine. If anything happens to 19 of them, it seems to be fine. So maybe it's just P53 that could help out that, but maybe not. There's still more research going on in this field. Maybe it's not just P53 that's important, but elephants also have like an epigenetic modifications that help sort of control P53. So maybe there's more to this. So maybe you can just give antioxidants that would help just cool down these reactive oxygen species and prevent the problems from happening to begin with. And so maybe with humans, we've been able to do this a lot with other animals, and we've tried improving humans with antioxidants before, and the results are sort of mixed. I think the field really just needs more attention to the edge, and that's what space is great at, right? Is pushing a lot of these use cases to the absolute edge. And so if we can try to focus on doing that and asking these questions like, well, what is the dose that's really required to get the effects we want? And are there different, like, are all antioxidants the same? And I think the short answer is absolutely not.
What?
So
Big surprise. Oh no. It's more
yeah.
complicated than we thought. Oh man.
And then and even on top of that, with Ryan and Vlad's points, like, is it so are all antioxidants the same? No. And then are all people the same? No. And so do we need different antioxidants for different people? Maybe. Is kind of the answer there. But I guess the opportunity then becomes, okay, can we learn enough to make good judgment calls on, okay, you have X mutation in X gene, and so you need X amount of X antioxidant. That sort of, I think, would be the starting point when it comes to what we're terming like genetic enhancement. Now, did we alter your genome at all? Absolutely not. We just used genetic information about you to make a good call, or hopefully a good call. That's enhancement, but it's not sort of interventional, if you will, or not really intruding on your genome and your genes and anything like that. So that I see as being like a potential first step for genetic enhancement, is sort of making up for your genetic weaknesses or your red flags or your, just Achilles heels with these endogenous. You can either do endogenous or exogenous antioxidants. So for the P53 example, that'd be something endogenous. But for like giving people more vitamin C, that'd be exogenous. These astronauts or patients would just take more vitamin C, maybe. So it's sort of, I think, one of the first steps when it comes to genetic enhancement, and most likely to start, would be these personalized cocktails, is what they're sort of being termed as.
So it
Yeah.
sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, either we do more antioxidants, like personalizing antioxidants, or base elephants is like the obvious second choice there.
I think we should ride elephants on the moon. Yes.
Have you guys heard about the hyper tumor idea
Yes.
for Plato's paradox? That's like the coolest thing ever.
Can you tell me about it or refresh
Yeah,
my
I will
memory?
try. I don't have the same background that Sean has, but essentially, what the answer for Pato, one of the answers, predicted answers for Pato's paradox, is the fact that in order for the tumor to actually kill a large animal, it needs to get to a big enough size in order to kill that animal. However, as the tumor grows in size, there may be some cells within that tumor that then realize, hey, we're gonna also become a tumor on top of the tumor. So essentially, they're a hypertumor, and then they start to compete for resources, killing each other off, which results in the cancer, the animal not dying from
Wow,
cancer.
that is a Rube Goldberg machine of an argument if I've ever heard one before.
Yeah, it's definitely one that if it was the case, we'd probably see like many more small tumors in these big animals, and that's just not quite what we're seeing. Maybe their immune systems are just really good at recognizing them and dispatching them. But it's it's a really interesting. It's cool because it's like evolution competing against evolution.
Mhm. Yeah, because I saw that there was no like actual data on it. I saw there were some silico models that were run that showed that like this could potentially be an answer for it, but I didn't see
Yeah.
that there's any data, like actual like taking a tumor and then passing it on from mouse to mouse to mouse to mouse to mouse, and then eventually that fitness of that tumor decreases because some of the cells have mutated in it.
Yeah, the Peto's paradox is cool because it's like almost every large animal, and we don't actually have very many large animals if you think about it, right? And so the ones we do have, almost all of them have different solutions. So I brought up elephants because the idea that we could give taking genetic enhancement to like a much larger step, give people more P53, somehow I go into that in another way, but if we could give it to them more of these genes because it seems pretty clear that having more equals better benefit. But that's already pretty rudimentary itself, right? And then you have all these other animals though. Like that'd be a really good argument if every animal just had more P53 because then it'd be a little bit more tested by,
Hmm.
biology. But that's not really the case. In fact, like whales, like blue whales, they have a whole nother mechanism. It seems like more it, all animals seem to solve it by manipulating this repair all these repair mechanisms in the genome, but in different ways. So
Yeah.
it's not clear that there is an easy answer for this. Gene copy number might not be the best solution. So there's definitely a lot more work
Hmm.
that needs to be done in this field. Part of what we were trying to do in my lab was if we could put this to the test in a model, but still waiting to find out.
Yeah, that conversation really reminds me of. So you talked about P53 as this, master kind of a gateway into replication. Another thing that commonly comes up, especially in the twin study, which I hope we get to talk about a little bit more today, is the idea that telomeres, or like the ends of the DNA, are a sign of aging. So every time you replicate your DNA, cells undergo division. They need to replicate the DNA. Due to how the molecular machinery happens, there's kind of a ragged edge at the very end of it that you eventually consume part of the end of the DNA in the normal replication process. And so we have essentially junk DNA at the ends of the chromosomes that you can tell how someone has aged based on the length of these telomeres. And so in early cancer biology, someone had the bright idea of making like a telomerase inhibitor, and getting rid of the thing that, or yeah, it actually increased telomerase, so the enzyme that refills those caps at the end of the chromosomes, and that turned out to just be cancer. So it's just not as
Yeah.
easy as just, oh yeah, we have this anti-aging thing. It's great. It's really not that clear. And I think that was one result of the twin study that a lot of people that I encounter out in the world had heard of. They're like, oh yeah, like isn't space this anti-aging thing? Like isn't it going to be so healthy going to space? And I'm always struck because I've come to the conclusion that it's like, in fact, if it's not even a normal aging process, it's like an accelerated aging process. So it's not good. It's not really, going to space is not a it's not healthy to do that. So
Yeah, I think it's I think it was good to see what came out of the twin study with the telomeres because in pop culture there's all this buzz about telomeres and like, oh, this, all these studies decreased or taking this supplement decreased the telomeres or like relative to whatever metric they're talking about, and they're always hyper focused on, oh, if we can just keep the telomeres from shortening, you'll live forever. And it's like, I don't know that it's that mechanistically connected. I think telomeres are obviously important, but space did a really good job of teasing out that, hey, while your telomere, not only did they not shrink, but they lengthened relative to his twin. However, every other metric was saying, hey, this is super not healthy, and there are still lots of problems. So it's like, it's strange, and we still need to figure out what that all means at the end of the day. But it was good at teasing out that, hey, telomere length isn't actually the perfect metric for how long you're going to live, or like what the age of your cells are, because while your telomeres might be longer, there could be a bunch of other holes in your genome that could cause a bunch of other problems.
It's a great way to think about it. It's like a whole family business is trying to keep the genetics running. And it's kind of cool too, like how we're talking about this in different animals and how different animals handle this issue of like cancer or even immortality to begin with. Like the common thing to think of is like a lobster being immortal. Like they remain fertile as they age. They technically have the same fitness, but they don't live forever. They essentially die when they get too big, or like they just stop molting. But they have telomerases that keep repairing the ends of their DNA, right? And so that could be like one approach. And then you can think about sharks, and their sharks have like an anti-VEGF like mechanism where essentially VEGF is how your body tells you to make blood cells, and tumors love this protein because then they can get the blood supply necessary to start growing in size. And somehow sharks are able to shut this down, stopping VEGF from working, which results in why they don't get as many cancers as we would like to think that they do, especially like the bigger sized sharks. So it seems like there's different approaches that you have to target, and then you have to think about like what about us makes us susceptible and weak to aging and cancers, then figuring out what are these pathways to target.
Yeah, the one fact I like about sharks is that sharks, as we know them, evolved before there were trees. It's just one of those like, one of those things that you just like throw out
You know that. That's so cool.
Yeah, they showed up
at a
during
party,
the
and you're like, oh
armored
yeah.
fish age, right? They showed up during the Devonian, I think, right? During the age of armored fish. So we have
I
that
mean,
fact.
I don't know.
I'm gonna Google this.
I just like have that in my pocket. I don't have any the extra detail. That's why I need to go to parties with you, so we can actually have more in-depth conversation.
Another cool animal is the musk deer. I'm fascinated by this animal currently. It's this saber-toothed deer, tiny. They're smaller than their other like deer cousins, but instead of making long antlers and very intricate antlers, um, they they've sort of internalized because the way deer make antlers is it's a very finely thin lined controlled like cancer growth, non-cancer growth of bone, but they control it in such a way that it doesn't end up being a problem. In fact, it's actually a defense mechanism and used for mating. But these musk deer evolved without these antlers, um, and somehow take advantage of a lot of the same mechanisms at really high latitudes. So they live in the mountains of Russia, and they're exposed to higher levels of radiation and are totally, or seem almost totally unaffected by it. And it's like they've borrowed from their ancestors like antler regulating mechanisms and now apply it to their other bones to make sure that they don't develop cancer at these latitudes. So it's fascinating. I want to learn way more about them. I want more people to study them because there might be something there, at least for
I had
bone
no
cancer.
idea. I had no idea before this conversation that there was a chance so many of the answers to like the radiation question of space travel could be found in like how other species are dealing with it here on Earth. It really hadn't occurred to me.
Yeah,
So,
actually, just a quick comment. Jessica Meir, a comparative physiologist and astronaut, was recently had some award based on her work that she did on the International Space Station, comparing different vertebrates and different behaviors in space. So definitely like interest in that. I think you just have to, be a good comparative biologist, then you can go to space. So, but I guess
awesome.
kind of getting back to the idea of antioxidants and space medicine and genetics. Maybe our nutritionally inclined friends can tell me about, like, do antioxidants work? Like, do they do they work well? If you were to give an astronaut an antioxidant, how much risk are we mitigating? Like 5%, 50%? Like what is the general, like, what is the thinking of how effective these medications are?
I guess I can at least, well, for me to come in here, I'm gonna essentially like skirt the question a little bit. I think that they are definitely known to work, but it's been a while since I've seen like data demonstrating the magnitude of the effect of like consumptions, for instance, of some of the things that you might see in like a food blog, like telling you to eat dark chocolate or like blueberries or something like that. Um, I don't know. Sean, do you happen to know any, do you happen to have any more details of like numbers?
Uh, numbers, no, not really off the top of my head. I will say, just like directionally speaking, from studying like nutrigenomics, it seems that so some nutrients or some like food sources and stuff like that can be really effective. Like I know turmeric and or curcumin, the
Mm-hmm.
active ingredient in turmeric, is actually extremely effective at being anti-inflammatory, right? And anti-inflammatory and antioxidant, they sort of go hand in hand sometimes depending on the conversation, because your immune system can produce a lot of reactive oxygen species just by doing its job. So if you can turn down that part, you can then prevent the reactive oxygen species, right? So, but that being said, a lot of these dietary sources, they seem to be effective, you know, if it's part of your diet consistently for a long period of time, and you're also trying to mitigate other sources. Like you can't just eat a bunch of turmeric and work in a, right next to a nuclear reactor and think everything's going to be perfectly fine. There are thresholds you're not going to be able to mitigate against.
Which essentially is what being in space is like working next to a nuclear reactor.
Right, right. So, um, yeah, yeah. I wish I had numbers off the top of my head to tell you about like what
I think
sort of magnitude.
the difficult part about coming up with a good answer to that is just the way that uh, research done on antioxidants is kind of laid out currently. Like Sean said, it's much more in like, does this lifestyle change like reduce mortality? And then it's dealing with like essentially decades of human life instead of just, brief periods of high exposure to radiation that would increase the amount of free radicals that exist in
Or they're
somebody.
just cell culture, right? Like, or
Sure.
they just give a bunch of these antioxidants in cell culture and say, hey, look, the cells were fine when blasted with radiation. And it's like, okay, I guess that's fine if you bathe in vitamin C, but I don't know if that really equates to dietary levels and absorption. I mean, we know the reason why, like, taking a purely classical pharmaceutical approach to to space health isn't the most advantageous field is because like absorbing things in space is difficult. Like fluid dynamics in space is weird, and we don't really know how all that can work exactly with traditional pharmaceuticals. So, you know, I don't think we can take a lot of the knowledge we have even here on Earth and apply it as well in space when it comes to dosing regimens
Mm-hmm.
and oral intake of things. So
It's also so complicated. You can't get like one group of people and not feed them antioxidants, and then another group of people and feed them antioxidants over a period of time. That's just not ethical. It's
right.
weird.
Yeah.
Can you poison yourself off antioxidants? I'm assuming if you have too much, that you can't get the electron transport change to work, right?
I mean, yeah, depending on which antioxidant we're talking about. I mean, even vitamin C is, even though it has a really good safety profile, there are levels that can have effects. Vitamin E, any of your lipid soluble
Oh,
vitamins for sure.
Yep.
absolutely, yeah.
I was just briefly looking at some like meta-analyses on PubMed, and the numbers uh, for a lot of this stuff are pretty good actually. The odds ratios for some, like of course I have no idea really what they're going on. This is just like one that I'm looking at that does a meta-analysis on antioxidant intake and its potential effect on reducing pancreatic cancer risk. And some of these odd ratios are down to like zero point 0.5 or below like 0.75, so pretty substantial, honestly. And I think there's a ton of like research on this field, but as it pertains to space, I think really the inference you can take with you is that it's probably good for astronauts to have fresh like fruit and vegetable sources of uh, antioxidant antioxidant agents and supplements where that's not possible.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
But with respect to like how much good that will actually do, or like
Yeah.
how many days of being in space that like having a good diet can offset, I have no idea, and I don't
Yeah,
think
I don't
we're
think.
gonna have a yeah we won't be able to know the answer to that one for a while.
Yeah, the way that I feel like it is currently is like we know that they're helpful, so we'll provide them as best we can.
Yeah.
And
I
they're
think
not gonna hurt, you know. And then you just kind
right.
of like okay, and then you do other things to mitigate radiation in other regards, and then that kind of like leaves us at the doorstep of the genetic enhancement, like actually going
Mhm.
fully into genetically enhancing. So it's like the argument would go, you know, space radiation is the biggest risk. Our current pharmacological, you know, tools are not effective at can never completely mitigate radiation effects. Therefore, we would suggest blah 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 and help an astronaut become safe for a trip to Mars or something like that. So that's how I would
Yeah.
see it going, and um, I don't know where that first step through that doorway is. So say you elect to genetically enhance an astronaut that has like this reactive oxygen species, antioxidant like superpower. Like, you know, would it be a CRISPR technology that would do that? Would it be something that you could do on an adult that's already been trained and selected? What would that even
Yeah.
look like? And if we're, you know, just gonna think about it and have fun with the topic.
Yeah. I so when trying to think to prepare for this, I was trying to think of what are the most likely and possible strategies that we would see implemented within like the next decade, right? Because there's this big push for Project Artemis going to the moon again and establishing like livable situation, and then of course Mars is the grand old prize that everyone wants to get to. And also somewhere in between all that is also like orbital structure, megastructures that people would live on. So and sprinkle in tourism, right? Like all the this is a whole push of a lot of time spent in space in the next decade. Um, so starting off in sort of like a ranked order, we have this personalized antioxidant cocktail. This would be something that would be administered both pre, during, and post flight. You would have GWAS scores that could calculate, you know, pre flight in order to prepare you, you'd need X amount, and then to maintain you, you need X amount, and then afterwards, you need X amount. Right? That'd be this uh, personalized cocktail for you. I don't think the technology is too far off from that. I think the ethics are pretty well aligned. Like we said, if we can develop some sort of rationale against like screening versus preparing sort of thing. Um, but then the next one from there in both like possibility and likelihood would be developing our ability to both monitor and control immune function while in space. And so, Vlad, you probably have a lot of great insights about this, but the idea that we're developing a whole field of biologic treatments for cancer patients with like immune dysfunction and stuff like that. Should we apply that to space? Could we apply because a lot of the problems that reactive oxygen species cause interact with the immune system, really. I mean, anything that goes wrong in like B cell germination could become like catastrophic as far as like one little problem in one B cell, and a B cell is your immune system. It replicates a bajillion times. Now it's a really big problem. You might have like melanoma, or not melanoma, um, myeloma.
Myeloblastoma. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to
And
remember how to
there's,
Wait,
say
there's a
that
bunch
word.
of
it
there's
would
a
be
bunch
like
of there's a bunch of B cell
leukemia.
ones.
Yeah.
There's like leukemia, lymphoma, either
Hmm.
or.
So, you know, I think in a lot of the immune system, uh, I always uh, describe it as the immune system speaks in a song-like fashion. Like the whole immune system is constantly playing a symphony via cytokine signaling, and you have orchestrators like dendritic cells and T helper cells, and if anyone's off tempo or if anyone's off beat and they're not properly dealt with, it becomes a big problem. And they can become offbeat, or they can sing the wrong tune, meaning they can signal the wrong cytokines, um, based, due to mutation, due to some sort of DNA damage. So there might be some low hanging fruit there. Like if we could target cells that, like from the twin study, some of the biggest stuff that's been jumping out at me is the proliferation of neutrophils. They have a bunch of neutrophils that are just wandering the body, and we know from COVID and the recent pandemic that too many neutrophils is a really bad thing, and gets out of hand really quickly. So like, can we control that? Can we control the behavior of their T cells or B cells? So I think that type of genetic enhancement, we're getting closer and closer in to like actually messing with the genome in this way. But even still, controlling the immune system uh, is still, like, we could do it with exogenous biologicals like monoclonal antibodies, or even this new field of RNA therapies, like long non-coding RNAs, and like interrupting uh, problematic RNA signaling. So immune cells use a lot of long non-coding RNAs to talk to each other, and you can tell a lot about inflammatory states based off of RNAs. So potentially that's the next step after this antioxidant cocktail would be intervening here. And then I've got two others, but I'd love to take your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we got to figure out how the system works and then target it with like various chemicals and antioxidants. Because if we can't definitively say, this is not working, messing with the instructions is going to be like, well, now we really don't know what we're doing, and we're
Mm-hmm.
going to irreversibly change it to the point where now we could potentially give somebody leukemia, like a really aggressive type that just knocks them out immediately. So it seems like that's like the approach you want to take. You want to figure out how the system works and then try to treat it with, exogenous chemicals, and you find out, oh, the avenue of which we give those, right, either orally or like with a shot or something, like, okay, there's a limitation there, like that's not going to work. So then let's take the next step, which is with those microRNAs that you're mentioning. And then I'm sure there's different approaches where you could change the gene itself, or maybe you could even provide, like I'm thinking about the SNMA treatment. I think it's
Mm,
called Zolgensma. Zolgensma, which is they use a virus to infect your
mm,
what are they called? Motor neurons, and then the virus sits in there producing the protein that keeps the cells alive.
Mm-hmm.
Versus where spinal muscular atrophy, your motor cells just die because they don't have a protein to keep them alive. What this medication does is you put a little cap, like a little helper in there that produces it. So you're not even changing the genetics per se, but you're offering
mm-hmm.
like maybe that could be an approach where you just have something that's producing this little
Mm-hmm.
building block that helps you defend against
You're
these reactive oxygen
you're on
species.
like the if entering the doorway of genetic enhancement is like editing the the genome, you're on the front porch is what you're talking about.
Yeah,
You're
exactly.
talking
Yeah.
about doing one step before it, and that definitely feels safer from a like an ethical perspective. Not saying that going through that door is off the table, but it definitely feels better from a therapeutic standpoint.
But it
Yeah.
seems we'll never get to editing germline. We're gonna stay at somatic and not go anywhere else.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah. I think yeah. So you touch on so that would be the third technology would be supplemental gene expression is what I sort of coined it, and so that would be these like sort of expressing these viruses or maybe some sort of other genetic architecture you could implement into specific cells or even body wide to express some sort of product that you want. Maybe that's P53, maybe that's um, this survival protein. So yeah, I think you're right. That's like it's getting your foot in the door in now what you could really consider genetic enhancement because you are genetically expressing something that is enhancing an ability. But like you said, you haven't changed anything. So you could probably install like kill switches. You could probably install some sort of ability to, hey, let's hit the Uno reverse button here, and if anything goes wrong, and that is a nice extra layer of safety. And then that next step would be full on genetic enhancement via embryonic edits. We've chosen this person to become a space explorer, like that is their whole goal for them, and obviously that is fraught with ethical dilemmas and very Gattaca-esque, very like Halo-esque too, with Master Chief and like taking children and making them be these space explorers and all this stuff. Like that would be the least likely, the
Mm-hmm.
least likely, and also the least possible. I mean, we're not anywhere near close to making any sort of definitive statements about, oh yeah, definitely you can do this. I mean, we have the one thing in China, and that's still very sketchy. We still don't have any data from that, and
Mm-hmm.
obviously, uh, ethically, just a mess. So I don't think we're gonna get there for this next stretch in space exploration. I don't think we need to get there. I don't think we need to face that question yet.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe our civilization in 2040s will deal with that question, but it's not necessary. In fact, we have several other avenues that we discussed that I think could do the job in many ways and very well.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah. Something that you brought up was the genetic selection from the embryo for someone who's going to be an astronaut. I kind of that's in science fiction a lot. But what is also in science fiction is that the people that stay on Earth versus the spacers. So in like the Foundation series, you have spacers, the people that go live and work in space early on when humanity's like going to the stars. They become a different, they genetically separate from humanity. And so it's like we won't have to make them or choose them. They will just being in that unique environment, given enough time,
Right.
on the order of many generations, you're going to have people that may adapt to that and may automatically have those genetic enhancements.
Are you
When you
suggesting we put a
oh, go
breeding
ahead.
population of people in a space station, and then, based on how they survive, they create kids who are selected for and live in that environment? Is
See,
that what I'm hearing from you?
I just feel like at this point it's like it's not the land isn't fertile enough. Like space isn't hospitable enough for us to. You have to put in so many people for only a handful to survive. So I feel like we need to make space more hospitable for that. Like that line of thinking to even
I
come to
would love
fruition.
to. I would honestly love to see or hear if any research is like animal research is done to kind of, or maybe with like Drosophila or something that replicate pretty quickly. If anything like this is already like been done or
Yeah,
underway.
I mean it's like genetic drift, right? Back to the Hardy Weinberg equation.
Mm-hmm.
It's it was discovered. I think I brought this up on a podcast before, but it's like a species of birds that like went over a mountain pass. Like it only took like 4 generations before they couldn't rebreed with the flock on the other side because they had just the environment had changed their genetics so much.
Yeah, Vlad, you bring up a really good point. I mean, I was speaking to there's a cool podcast group that a bunch of high schoolers were asking me these really great questions that I was fascinated. I was so happy they were thinking about this because they're really going to be part of the generation that decides a lot of these stuff. But their main question was like, why aren't we using CRISPR to make these edits in babies right now? Right? Like they're pretty excited to do it. But and I told them I was like, well, like if you get to you're sort of we're going to come down to two possibilities here if we're going to want to live on Mars, right, or the moon, is that you're either going to do this Hardy Weinberg experiment where you send a bunch of people there and the best survivors who interbreed with each other just become a different species, or we try and design a species of people to go there, right? Like it's going to go one way or the other. Are we equipped to make any of these decisions? No, not even in the slightest. But is it ethically right to let a whole bunch of people go there and just keep dying until they don't? I don't think so either, right?
No.
So, but really and honestly, obviously, the question or the answer is not either or. You can send people there and you can support them as much as you can, right? You can practice medicine and try to protect as many people as possible for as long as you can, and that's ultimately what it's going to come down to, I think. And like you were saying, Kyle, with the idea of genetic drift, like it's going to depend a lot about admixture, right? So like how often are people on Mars having children with people on Earth? Probably not going to be that often, but that'll decide on how people sort of evolve over time.
Yeah, it's. I think it's just so. It's kind of back to the beginning of the orbit. Like genetics is such a fast moving field in the sphere of healthcare that everyone at some level, new doctors, old doctors, like in the next 10 years is going to be practicing genetics at some level. At some level. Like some won't really, but what I'm getting at is genetics is a tool that we are sharpening, that it will be negligent and probably illegal not to use genetics in some regard, in terms of a screening, in terms of something to prevent some kind of disease. And it's just going to be so fascinating to see, how the technology is going to influence, what we do with it, how our ethics are going to inform, the kind of the back arrow to what technology we allow to get developed. Usually that doesn't happen very much. Usually our technology is just running super far in the future, and it's like, oh yeah, we'll deal with the ethics, but years later. But yeah, I think it's just an interesting. We are refining these tools of genetics. What are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
Where are we going to go?
Yeah, we got. I mean, as we develop our tools, we have to be careful. Like I know you mentioned this already, Sean, about the experiment that was done in China. That kind of a lot of geneticists would say that kind of like put the field back a little bit, right? Because it put a lot of fear.
Mm-hmm.
Because was it indicated? I mean, the kid is now going to be, even though the kid will be, I think it was there will be immune to HIV because the receptor that HIV attacks is
Yeah.
changed. This receptor is not going to do its job nearly as well as a receptor that isn't mutated, right?
Right. Yeah. It
So
was a. No, go on.
yeah, no, yeah. Essentially, what you're saying is this kid's now going to be more susceptible to disease, even though there wasn't much of a risk for HIV to begin with, because the HIV, I believe, was in the father and not in the mother, so there's going to be no transmission to begin with. Or the disease wasn't going to pass on to the father because the kid was inside the mom, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So in asking these questions about like what are we going to do with the genetic tools, I mean, like I like the approach that Sean brought up first. Is kind of like we're figuring out what we're going to do, but in terms of like mutating outside of rare diseases like outside of diseases that target a very specific thing like sickle cell, or SNMA and spinal muscular atrophy. That makes, or Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which is a disease where your muscles don't attach to the outsides of your cells, so your muscles don't work. Those are very, very targeted genes that you can target and then make a change, and then boom, you have what you need to do. But
So
even then, we still don't know what's going to happen in the long
using it
term.
more of a restorative way instead of an
Yeah,
enhancement kind of way. Yeah.
right. And I feel like I don't think we're ever gonna make designer babies in terms of targeting the germline, because if you are going to target the germline, the cells that you pass on to your kids or that you make the kids with, that entire life, that entire family is always going to
It's
be
changed.
mutated. Yeah, that
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
you haven't changed one person, you've changed an entire family
generation.
generation. Yeah, perfect. That's the word
Hmm.
I'm looking for. Generation of kids into the future, right? And some of those kids be like, I don't want to have this because I didn't know that there's going to be this effect that we just couldn't predict.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I mean, the idea that germline editing is you are making a decision for a patient, for the next patient, but also all of their offspring from now on. Like, I don't even know how to compute that sort of that ethical dilemma. I mean, in medicine, we hype on that autonomy is like the number one pillar that we try to preserve, and that just eliminates
Mm-hmm.
autonomy or generation. So like, I don't know how to even swallow that pill. But what I'm worried about is that, like you mentioned, we need to face the ethics while we make these improvements. And then it's the first time in history that we're really actually doing that. I mean, if we look back even in the earlier 20th century, it's an abhorrent mess of eugenics and problems of technology. Um, and obviously, we don't ever want to go back to that. And so this is the first time we're really trying to say, like, hey, are we doing the right thing every step of the way? But the problem is we're not all saying that. Like the problem is some countries with some really large budgets and their own space programs might not make these same conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what scares me the most because while they're not like we're trying to limit in a lot of ways the growth potential of these programs by asking these ethical questions, and I 100% think we should be. But countries that don't and get the upper hand, and like their decisions could compound exponentially. I mean, and I worry about how that will play out. I don't know. So that is just one thing I'm always trying to watch. And after what happened with the Chinese citizen or the Chinese scientist, I think China's initial reaction was very proud of what he said he accomplished. But then it very quickly in the news became like he disappeared. He literally was gone, and a lot of problems. And to I don't think anyone can convince me that the Chinese government didn't know he was doing or didn't know what he was doing while he was doing it. I mean, the Chinese government knows everything about what everyone's doing there in their academic field. So makes me wonder, right? And they're not the only country that has the ability to do these things. That's kind of the concern with genetic technology is that this isn't like nuclear bombs where you need huge teams of really brilliant people to make a lot of trouble. You don't you could do a lot of this stuff with small teams and low budgets. So it, I'm happy that the international community is really taking their time and developing, ethical frameworks to work in, even when it comes to this, not even just germline editing, but like just embryo editing, and just human editing in general. And I hope we take our time and like I said, I hope this is these are decisions we make in like
Mm-hmm.
2040 because I don't think we need to make these decisions now. I think if we started pushing down that field, the whole human genome editing field, it's way too early.
Mm-hmm.
Way too early.
I love how you brought up the historicity of genetics, and especially with this play with eugenics, right? Like what's happening in the United States, people getting sterilized because of genetic principles, right? This was against autonomy. This was completely unethical, right? This issue of being completely irresponsible with this extremely powerful tool is prevalent
Mm-hmm.
everywhere, and it can impact anyone anytime if you're really aware of what we're doing. Because like, I mean, it might be kind of funny and harmless now to think about like, oh, we could scan your genes to find out what wines you like the most, right? That's like a
Yeah.
service that you could purchase right now. Like, the fact that these are very small teams, like you said, it's kind of scary when you think about it, how powerful these tools are in the hands of certain in such small groups at such low budgets.
Yeah. I think as we're kind of approaching orbit, we have about 15 minutes left. I just kind of want to have like a to kind of maybe you guys can help me find my thoughts on this, just as like a summary, of like where we're at. Maybe everyone does their own individual summary, but I'll just start with mine. Kind of based on the last like 5 or 10 minutes of conversation, I just want to say that like space flight is not a free ticket to do eugenics. It's just like it. We're talking about using genetics as, in my opinion, space medicine is largely a preventative field. We want to prevent situations from occurring in the future if we have some kind of grasp of what's going to happen. And therefore, genetics has a unique ability for being able to scan, lots of data about the genome, person's history, and be able to discern genetic changes that may come up during the course of a space mission. And I think as we refine those tools, the preventative and screening tools are going to be really important. I'm not sure what that means in terms of mission capability. Are certain people going to be essentially taken off of a given mission based on a given genetic risk? But I can imagine that's happening kind of already in a different context. If you've gone to space for a number of hours, you're radiation limited. So, maybe like it'll start by the number of hours that you've been up, multiplied by some multiplier of your susceptibility to radiation or something like that. And that seems like a mission critical thing to do. So I really see like that would be the first logical kind of like step, like screening prevention, very much in the wheelhouse of aerospace medicine. And then in terms of the kind of restorative genetic enhancements, those would be kind of, those technologies maybe need to be better honed for astronauts. And then in terms of actually editing genes, in terms of CRISPR technology, that kind of stuff, that seems like something that luckily we don't have to deal with at this point. So those are just kind of my summary thoughts. And I'm curious if you guys have any other takeaways just to kind of wrap it up. And if you agree or disagree with what I just said, I don't know.
I actually love that idea of like having a susceptibility score, of trying to like calculate something based on like information that you get from looking at an astronaut candidate's genome, and probably a number of other factors like their previous exposures and where they lived and what they had going on before applying.
Yeah, just make one, like that's one of those things where say, oh, just make one of those things, and it's like it's probably incredibly complicated to do such a thing.
I think doing scoring systems like that, there's precedence for that elsewhere in medicine. I know a lot of EMRs try to like come up with mortality scores and stuff, for instance. And then we of course have things like BMI, which are used for predictors. And historically, they're not great at like really predicting anything on an individual level, but in terms of like general trends, they're not bad. So maybe something like that is at least like possible or workable, right? And then the other thing I wanted to mention is I posted in your Discord an article. You don't have to pull it up or anything, but I was kind of looking into this question of like what really are we seeing in terms of mortality for astronauts compared to Earthbound individuals over time, specifically looking at things like cancer. And so far, at least from what I could find, in these publications came out in like in the year 2000 or in the late 90s, it looks like there really hasn't been, as of yet, any difference between the cancer-related mortality of people who have been to space versus people who have been on Earth. And obviously, we've got a subject number issue there because we have like less than 600 people who have ever been into space, period, at this point, and probably only like a sixth of those have been included in these studies or whatever. But I think at least our heads are in the right place, because I think when we add more time into the equation here, we're going to start to see some divergence between astronaut populations and us ground-dwelling folk, and as we go forward.
That's gonna be millions of years in the future, I feel, unless we start going in
Are,
with like germline mutations and things of that nature, right? Because if you do a somatic mutation, if you like inject some kind of like virus that hits all your muscle cells somatically, you're not gonna pass that down to your kids, right? That's just gonna stay in your muscles, as far as I know. You know.
oh, I think I was just meaning purely from like a radiation exposure
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
context. You
Like
know, like
accelerated mutation.
yeah, we know that they're exposed to increased cellular stress from radiation and from other factors. We just haven't really seen that yet in terms of mortality.
That
So
actually makes me ask the question like, oh wow, I'm going to be very curious to see how um, children of astronauts uh, uh, does exposure to space and then having children afterwards. Is there anything like accelerated mutations or accelerated evolution in any sort of way? I don't know. That'll be interesting.
that's got to be a really small number of people, I would think, but who have had children after going into space. But I would love to know about that too, and I think that would definitely hold a lot of answers as far as like settling on places like the moon or Mars or what have you as well.
Yeah, I guess we need to look at studies to see like even this even gets to the conversation of evolution and how does mutation inform evolution? Like you have conserved regions of your genome, you have regions of your genome that are not conserved that are more likely to be mutated as you live and as you know have babies and pass on and everything like that. So it's a very complicated question here with many different facets.
Yeah.
but
Yeah, this is.
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You got it. I was just gonna say something kind of more in summary, but go ahead.
I don't know. I was just kind of like interested in this kind of like screening panel that you were mentioning, Ryan, because like I know like we could do like cancer panels right now for the general population if you were at risk of cancer, right? Like there's you have to like reach certain groups, like someone in your family has to have pancreatic cancer, and then boom, you get the go ahead to get genetic screening, right? So I'm
Mm-hmm.
wondering, like, would we start off in those kinds of areas first, kind of like the basic stuff that we do know, and then slowly add things on as we see it, or are we going to have to create this kind of comprehensive panel, things including like bone density, muscle density, and your likelihood of like cardiac risk, that kind of a thing?
Yeah, I think yeah, we'll definitely start developing screening methods, especially with the growth of polygenic risk scores and multivariate sort of genetically intertwined scores that are coming out. You know, there's a lot of promise in that field and a lot of efforts by our government to make that a thing. So I could definitely see that being applied to our astronauts. I mean, you know, if you're in the top quartile of people who can develop blood clots, you know, what sort of pressures are we now putting you in addition to sending you to
Yeah,
space, right? Like
yeah.
maybe that's too high. But I think what we'll need is probably like space flavored polygenic risk scores, right? Like we'll
Yeah.
get to a point where we have enough people in space or who have gone to space where we can start forming these. And obviously we're going to need way more people, right? I mean, a lot of these polygenic risk scores require hundreds of thousands. And I think at the end of the day, as it always ends up being in genetics, is that we have a power problem as far as the statistics are concerned. So a lot of these questions won't be answered until we breach some sort of scale issue, which is unfortunate. And hopefully we can pull a little bit from, or quite a bit from health here on Earth. But I think that's the problem we're going to face for now is just getting enough data that means anything. I mean, even with this twin study, it's an N of one, right? Like we can look at it and gawk at how interesting it is, but it's not super informative as far as what we need to worry about or not. But it is very good at pointing in certain directions and worth looking at those directions. So, I mean, I guess just to summarize, what I was sort of my ideas is again this idea that there's a combination of what's most likely and what's most possible over the next decade. Um, Most likely and most possible are these personalized cocktails or personalized treatments that people can go through that hopefully will help people who might be filtered out. It could like uh, boost them up enough, like you could fill in the gaps, right? And this would be a case in where genomics actually allows more people to go to space instead of disallows them. And so then after that, we would get more control and understanding of immune function while in space. And I think that's coming pretty pretty quickly. And then after that, you get more supplemental gene expression, which we're kind of dipping our toe into that field now with mRNA vaccines and RNA therapies and that the viral technology we're talking about. So I think we'll see that for sure in like full bloom, probably late 2020s, early 2030s, in such a way that it'll be extremely powerful and probably enough to make extreme advancements in space, like living on the moon and potentially living on Mars. And then at the end of the spectrum is going to be this full-on genetic modification, and yeah, that's what I'm getting out of it.
Ryan or Vlad, do you have any last kind of summaries or anything you guys want to say?
No, it's been a blast, and I really enjoyed the discussion. I thought this is a lot of cool stuff and a lot of new things for me to think about. So I appreciate it.
There's not enough time in an orbit.
Yeah, I actually, if anything, the last 20, 30 minutes of conversation made me think of is, oh my God, there is so much work to do. There are some some of these articles that I pulled up and shared with you guys before the show. There's some like big heavy hitters in the field of space genetics. So Dr. Chris Mason out of Cornell,
Yeah.
Dr. Bichetti. These are just people that are on the Twitterverse that you can talk to them, and these are experts in the field about space genetics. And I think this field is only going to grow. I mean, space medicine in general is going to grow. I mean, virtually from nothing. So, I mean, anything is growth at that point. But oh my God, there's going to be so much work to do. And that makes me excited. I mean, I think at the beginning of the show, just chatting with you, Sean, it was, we were both kind of struck that space medicine is kind of this, like, it's definitely a frontier, and there's just so much to do. And we were both really excited by that. And I hope that if anyone stumbles upon this podcast or catches us on Twitter or whatever, we're just really excited about this field, and in every aspect of medicine is going to be a part of it. So I just think it's really exciting.
Yeah, I'm really thankful you guys had me on. This was an awesome conversation. You do not get to have cool conversations like this very often, so super grateful for this Discord and you guys just having this space. I think, well, what I know is that what space is really good at doing is pushing our technological limits and understandings to, its edge, and we have to figure out ways to find, or to solve problems, and those solutions we get in space trickle down onto Earth in magnificent ways. I mean, we've got GPS, we've got CT scanners, we've got a number of amazing technologies from space that was required to solve a solution in space first. So when I think about what we talked about today, and the whole reason I'm even interested in this field is because I think the benefits we're going to get for the plain old Earthling is going to be the Earthling patient is going to be phenomenal. I mean, if we could control immune cells in space, what could we do on Earth? I mean, the amount of diseases that are intertwined with immune dysfunction, or even just a personalized cocktail for an astronaut. Like, could you have personalized cocktails for people here on Earth that are truly beneficial in throughout their lives? I mean, it'll be amazing, and I'm super excited to see how this field pushes the edge and returns in dividends for everyone here, and healthcare in general is improved by it.
Yeah, it's like just Sean, it was so nice to meet you. I definitely consider you my new space nerd friend, and just thank you for taking the time. We're all medical students here, so we're all busy, doing either research or trying to survive clinicals or tests or all that kind of stuff. So schedules are tough, and just really appreciate you coming on and just having a great time. You have an incredible perspective, and just really thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
And with that, we will end the show and say thanks for listening to Let's Talk Space Medicine. If you want to continue the discussion and meet more fellow space nerds, be sure to check out @TalkSpaceMed on Twitter and the Let's Talk Space Medicine server on Discord. Thanks, and see you next orbit.